Hi readers, welcome back to my channel. We are about to go through May's reading wrap up. I got through 7 books this month and finally got onto some non-fiction. The first book I read was The God of Small Things. This book came out in 1997, so nearly 20 years ago, and it won the Booker Prize that year. The story is set in Kerala, India in 1969, and it threads through to 1993 as well. It doesn't have a straight, 69 through to 93 tale. It goes back and forth between the different timelines. The central characters are twins Rahel and Astapin. As adults in 93, they come back together and we hear quite a bit from Rahel's perspective and hear her reflections, but we don't so much hear from Astapin. And when we go back in time and learn what happened to them as children and the particular tragedies that affected him, you can really see why that's the case. I can see why the book won the Booker Prize. It is a super unique style of writing and it tells a really, really tragic tale. I think for that reason, I wouldn't particularly recommend it to anyone, only because it's just really so sad. It doesn't bear to read almost. The next book, Lonely Mouth, is by a local Australian author and it's set in Darlinghurst in Sydney. She's a waiter working at a really popular Italian restaurant, absolutely head over heels in love with her boss, which she shouldn't be, and she has a long distance relationship with her younger sister Lara, who's this cool young carefree model in Paris. The girls are half-sisters that share a unreliable mother and quite a chaotic childhood, which is affecting them both in different ways. They were left behind in a toilet as children, which was pretty shocking to read. And Matilda's way of dealing with that trauma is to control things, and she's controlling things by some pretty intense bulimia. This was also a bit of a heavy book that I wouldn't particularly recommend. The next book I read was Lost Lambs, and I actually had to check where the author Madeline was from because it very much gave chaotic, funny Irish writer to me, but she's actually American, which really surprised me. No offense to Irish people or Americans, but I just really pictured her as an Irish writer. This is actually probably the lowest rated book of the ones I read this month. However, I really, really enjoyed it and it was probably my favorite for the month. If you enjoyed the book Beasting from a few years ago, that was by Paul Murray, who was an Irish writer, and that one set up a bit of a dysfunctional family vibe. This does the same thing, but it's much shorter and it's hilarious. I think after 2 super heavy books, I was probably really open and ready for something of this level, like just pure chaos. We get the perspective and point of view of the different members of the family. So we have the parents that are, on the verge of breaking apart, and we have the 3 daughters who are different, very, very different from each other. So we have the older daughter who's dating this much older guy who's known as War Crimes Wes, which is not a great start. The middle daughter is in an online relationship with a terrorist, and the youngest daughter, who is probably everyone's favorite character, certainly is mine, is very, very bright, very, very dry, and sees through everything. So the family get caught up in this weird criminal conspiracy. The whole thing is just wacky, chaotic, funny. I think if you're open to something a little bit different, it's a great read. All right, the next book, Watermoon, bored me to start with. I thought, oh no, it's another magic realism book, and I just don't know, they don't really catch my attention. I feel like they're kind of the same thing over and over. However, as I kept reading, this one was super unique. So if you've got a vivid imagination and you can really picture what they're putting to you, I think that you'll thoroughly enjoy it. So for example, there are scenes where they were in this kind of parallel universe where everything operates differently, and they're attending a market which is set up above the clouds and you could fall off, and it was really, really vivid in that way. Overall, I don't think I'm fully convinced about magic realism books, and I don't know why I keep picking them up, but this one did have a lot more interest to me than others I've read in the past, and yeah, I can really see this lending itself well to a TV show or a movie, possibly anime style. The next book, the director started on a super strong note. The first chapter was really captivating as it showed you someone that was losing their memory, and either their unwillingness to know that that was happening or their unawareness. It doesn't really show you which, but is such an interesting thing to witness. The faded memory that we are looking into is the time that this particular gentleman spent in Nazi Germany working with a famous German director, and then we kind of travel into that story and into the past and learn more about that particular director. So I don't actually know if this is a real director that existed or not. Like, I'm very aware it was a fictional book, but I wasn't sure it was based on real characters. Nonetheless, so we have a director who was famous and had a couple of movies out. He moved to Hollywood at the height of the Nazi rise across Europe, but he was quite unsuccessful there. He ends up having to go back to Austria because his mother is unwell, and when he's there, he's approached by, you know, I guess the leader of propaganda, and agrees to start working for them. The author really makes you think about how people can become collaborators and agree to do despicable things. In this particular director's mind, I think at some point in the notion that he was going to be creating art, but there's some pretty awful things that transpire, given the themes I've mentioned, not particularly surprising. Again, maybe a bit too heavy. I think so far I've mentioned the heavier books, or the topics that were a little bit more complex, I didn't love so much. I think I'm really leaning towards chaos and fun. Okay, so next up we had my first nonfiction of the year, which was 1929 by Andrew Sorkin. So I think he's done a couple of these, but this is the first that I certainly recall reading of his. What he does is take historical documents and accounts from the 1929 Wall Street collapse, and also documents a little bit before and after, to be able to tell us this story in a lot more depth and colour. It's really interesting to see how much history repeats itself. So even though this is 1929 and we're here in 2026, you can kind of really see these things having not changed that much. It gives great insight into how long that kind of financial and political influence have tied in with each other, and I don't really think too much has changed since then. I think theoretically it should have put me off the share market. However, for some reason I kind of weirdly like, oh well, stuff it, I want to be part of it. If they're all making $1 billion, why can't I? But I don't have any dollars to start with, so I guess I'm out of the game. I finished the month off with a memoir. So this is by Belle Burden, and she delves into the really surprising, certainly to her, breakdown of her marriage that happens really overnight and takes her by surprise. While Belle lives a very different life to most of us, I would say, with a second home, being part of fancy clubs, having a fancy apartment, I don't think all of us can picture that, but I think a lot of people have had the very unfortunate experience of being unceremoniously dumped, and it's just universally shit. And she went through it in COVID and is very open and honest about it. I can imagine in Belle's circles it's very untoward to be so open and frank and disclose so much about your life and what's going on. So I think that makes this particularly surprising. I hear that they're going to make a film adaptation of this, so I'll be interested to see how that plays out. Alright, that brings us to the end of May. Sorry for the somewhat wacky lighting during this video. It's just started raining, so I don't know what's going on. We have so many books to read in June to try and get up to 50 for the halfway point of the year, so wish me luck, and I will see you next month.